German police have disrupted a far-right plot to seize power. They arrested dozens of people on Wednesday, but as right-wing parties win more votes and even power in some EU states, are we seeing a broader shift to the right in European politics? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, police and intelligence services in Germany say they've disrupted a right-wing plot to overthrow the government. They conducted raids across 130 sites nationwide, arresting what they said were ringleaders, including a 71-year-old prince, a retired senior military officer, and a judge and former far-right MP. Prosecutors believe that that group was planning an attack on Parliament. Now, we'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Dominic Kane in Berlin.
Thursday has been very much about reaction to the events of Wednesday, the arrests of those 25 people, the searches in so many different states in Germany, and the very clear sense that something serious had been planned, which the authorities say they've thwarted. And that is reflected in the news media, certainly in the newspapers. Here, this is the Süddeutsche Zeitung newspaper saying security forces thwart a strike against the state, a coup d'etat, in other words, with a picture of the alleged ringleader Heinrich Reuss being led away by heavily armed police officers. Same sort of imagery in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and this time it says a strike against the Reichsbürger movement or group. Well, that's important because that's where the attention is focused. This far-right grouping that wants to see a return to the imperial Germany that governed this country prior to the end of the First World War. The interesting thing being other questions. How could some of these people in this alleged plot reach such positions in society as a former member of that parliament? Someone who was in that parliament representing constituents until last year and is now accused or suspected of having plotted to overthrow it. So many questions being asked. Dominic Kane for Inside Story in Berlin.
I want to take a quick look now at where far-right parties have made gains across Europe. Italy's leader, Giorgia Meloni, became Prime Minister there after September's election, leading the most right-wing government since Mussolini. The German far-right party, the AfD, did badly in elections in May, but still has about 20% support in the East. France's far-right increased its number of MPs nearly tenfold after June's legislative elections, becoming the main opposition now. Poland's Nationalist Law and Justice Party has been in government since 2015, with some of its right-wing policies leading to disputes with the EU and sanctions. And Hungary's right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orbán won his fourth election in April, while the far-right Sweden Democrats hold the balance of power there, with a minority coalition government dependent on their support. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Berlin, we have Ben Aris. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. In Rome, we have Eleonora Poli. She's the head of analysis at the Centres for European Policy Network. And in Northampton, UK, Paul Jackson, a professor in the history of radicalism and extremism at the University of Northampton, and also the author of Pride in Prejudice, Understanding Britain's Extreme Right. A warm welcome to each of you. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Ben, I'm going to start with you in Berlin. The arrest of a former member of the Bundestag and a member of the AfD, and that must be sending shockwaves through Germany. Just how fringe is the group that we're talking about?
It's pretty fringe, and of course everyone's talking about this. It came out of left field, and it's the last thing you expect in somewhere as organised and democratic as Germany is a coup d'etat by a former prince, or indeed a real prince. However, it's a pretty fringe group. The police, when they're commenting on and looking at it, saying that they were actually extremely disorganised, that the plans they had were not realistic, and that this really wasn't going to go anywhere. I mean, the chances of success were nearly zero. Nevertheless, it sort of represents an undercurrent here. I mean, there's a group of people in the Reichsbürger. It's an organization which has been lobbying for a long time, and it says that Germany should have its sovereignty back, that it should go back to a monarchy. And the leader of this group, Heinrich III, he was intending to come back as some sort of ruler in a sort of monarchic sense, and take Germany back to its, its former glory when pre-war, when it was a bunch of principalities and a senior and powerful country in Europe. And there's some sympathy with that. But really, at the end of the day, I think most people are considering these people to be a bunch of fringe, extreme nutters.
Sure. Well, the group, I believe, was also influenced by what's been happening in the US, the rise of QAnon, the attack on the Capitol. Eleonora, let me ask you, how have events across the Atlantic affected or influenced groups, far-right and extremist groups in Europe? Have they been emboldened, perhaps?
Well, I think, radicalism in Europe, especially right-wing radicalism in Europe, is on history. It is related somehow to, what happened in the US, but it has its own reasons and history. I would say that in the EU is mostly related to a sort of social malcontent, of discontent within, the economic governance. And I think, it's also a matter of sovereignty. In many European member countries, people are asking their sovereignty back against the EU or against, the traditional political parties. So it has, some connections, but still it has its own, path.
Well, this in particular was a known group, and I know many of their members have been quite open about their beliefs and also how they themselves were radicalized, many on social media portals. I believe the pandemic has created plenty of time for that. So, Paul, let me ask you, you work on radicalization. Would this have not been possible with the technological shifts that we've seen?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly technology is really important to think about the way in which the far-right space operates today. But also this is a group that's got a rooting in a kind of a longer sense of tradition, and also other factors other than technology I think are important to think about, not least the impact of the pandemic and the ways in which that's changed spaces like this that are also driven by conspiracy theories as well. So I think there's a kind of a cluster of things are important to think about here.
You mentioned these conspiracy theories. A lot of them are around some kind of shadow power structure, secretly controlling government. Ben, how common are conspiracy theories when it comes to radicalizing people across Europe?
They're very common, but a lot of these theories, I think, are justifications for groups that have predisposed in opposition to the status quo, the way things are. And they're symptomatic of, there are some serious problems and some very large changes that have been going on. And I think a lot of these extreme groups, their reactions to things like migrants we have. I mean, here in Germany, we had in the 90s about 8 million Russians arrive. And then more recently, during the Syria war, we had 1 million Syrians arrive. And of course, there's a large Turkish population that's been here for a long time. And very recently, another 300,000 Ukrainians have arrived. And so that all creates a background whereby the Germans at some point, some of them start asking, what are these foreigners doing here in our very comfortable land? And we're spending money on them, we're giving housing to them, we're giving them support. And it's that the populists play on, and the conspiracy theories. I mean, if you look at the agenda of Heinrich XIII, they're talking about how the sovereignty, the Germanness of Germany has been destroyed. And that's what they want to go back to. It's a sort of return to Germany for the Germans. And the conspiracy theories then is you just get into the details of how do we get here? And so in Heinrich III's case, they're talking about a deep state, and they're talking about, international forces that are imposing foreign companies on here to make profit. Or it may be they focus on things like the migration. And you've also got economic inequality here, which is sort of eating away. And people feel like they're being done down and that other people are taking advantage of them. And they come up with theories in order to explain how that works.
Sure. Well, this feels like a good time to take a bit of a step back from radical groups per se and look at political parties, because we have seen a broad shift towards the far right across a number of countries in Europe. And I'm curious because you mentioned the word populist there, Ben. A lot of these are described as far-right populist groups. And I want to spend a moment on the idea of populism. So it derives from this belief that there's a rift between the people and then some kind of elite who are plotting against it, and then the populist leaders themselves are the defenders of the masses. Paul, for me, that sounds like it's built on fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of description of populism is really interesting. I mean, one thing to think about is that type of theme of populism can be found in into all forms of fascism as well, which propose similar ideas that the mainstream political systems are corrupt and that they need to be replaced by something different. One of the main differences with today's populists is that they operate within the rules of the game, but in quite a radicalized way. So they don't try to overturn democracy, but they do push against many aspects we might call liberalism. So that can be really problematic. And the other thing to think about is the way in which this kind of politics has shifted and become much more normal over the past 20 years or so. I mean, when Jean-Marie Le Pen went for a presidential campaign in the early 2000s, this was internationally reported as something very strange, very unusual, and it was a very, very significant news story and event. When Marine Le Pen has made much more successful campaigns in the last couple of French presidential elections, this has become quite normalized situations and isn't really talked about as being very odd or unusual. So populism of this type has become much more accepted within European politics over the last 20 years. And it's had a variety of impacts, from things like Brexit in the UK to helping to normalize cultures of Islamophobia and so on. And it's also helped to bring in languages that used to be much more the purview of the very extreme right, such as things like the Great Replacement theory, the idea that Europeans are under attack through some sort of conspiracy. So, as I say, this has become much more established as part of the mainstream sphere of politics than it used to be 20 years ago.
We'll look at some of the drivers that you've mentioned there, Paul, in just a moment. But I feel like it might be worth taking a moment to look at the demographics of the people who are driving this shift, because that gives us a bit of a clue. I was looking at a study that suggests it isn't necessarily deprivation. We've talked a little bit here about the economic situation being a driver, but that it's not necessarily deprivation that's driving people to vote for far-right parties, but more the fear of deprivation, which suggests that they have something to lose, right? Eleonora, it isn't those who are living in poverty who are voting for these parties.
Yes, I think it's one of the elements that we have to consider is this constant fear by, the working class and the middle class to lose more welfare. And that's, one of the reasons why all these anti-migrations rhetoric has been raising, because people are afraid to lose, their welfare, and also are afraid to lose their cultural identity. And these are exactly the points where, those far-right parties or movements are building their propaganda using, populist rhetoric, in the sense that they provide, easy answers to, much bigger problems. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is also that, is it true that traditional parties, unfortunately, are unable to provide, effective answers, in the sense that if you look at many European countries, right-wing parties like center-right or center-left parties, their policies are most of the time not really different. So, voters, they don't find, they don't see any difference voting, for this party or the other, when it comes to, do some actions in order to change the situation or to provide solutions. On the other hand, you have this the emerging of this movement, which are much vocal, which put themselves closer to the people who are suffering, because there is also the other element that is often used is the victimization. So normal people are the victim of the system. They are the outsider from the benefits of economic globalizations or, globalization per se.
Eleonora, sorry. Sure. I mean, just there, though, you touched on a point that I'd like to dig into a little bit, because you suggested that this is a new movement. But a number of these parties, like France's National Rally, for instance, now called the National Rally, they've been around for a long time. It's their, 50th anniversary, I believe, this year. But they were tiny to begin with, and they've gradually gained support. They've notoriously been very vocal about immigration issues. We've talked a little bit about that, but it feels like it goes beyond that to more of a values question. Ben, let me throw this to you. I'm curious because you alluded to something there when you were talking about Germany and the idea of sovereignty in an old Germany. How much has a generational shift contributed to this?
I think quite a lot. Germany Berlin, I mean, since I've been living here in 2003, has changed. When I came, you had to speak German, no one spoke English. And over the last 20 years, it's transformed into an international city, and everybody speaks English. And moreover, even if you speak German to them, they answer you in English because there's so many foreigners here. People are starting to invest into it, and the younger generation has sort of bought into that to some extent. But at the same time, this thing of sovereignty is still very strong, and there's this tension there. I mean, we cover Eastern and Central Europe, and there it's even more noticeable that the reaction against it, that there's a fault line, a values fault line, and to the left of it in traditional EU in the West, it's much more liberal, and the ideas of democracy and multicultural tolerance is prevalent everywhere. However, as soon as you go past Austria into Central Europe to countries like Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, they're based much more on an orthodox, traditional set of values, where Hungary's for the Hungarians, but it's also about family values, that they're almost, universally and homophobic. And so people doing gay prides over there. In the Central Europe and down into the Balkans, it's even stronger. And there's this sort of clash, and that's definitely amongst the young people too, because they're looking for a new identity now that, there's been these huge changes, and the countries, particularly in Central Europe, have now grown. They've come out of the transformation that was the end of the socialist bloc, and now they're quite strong. And I think you're seeing people like Orban or Kaczynski in Poland are pushing for this, new Poland, this new identity within Europe as a European, but they're pushing back against the rest of Europe as well and resisting the values, because part of the European Union project is about values, and they've taken the money, but they've rejected the values to some extent. And they're selling that to the young people, and the young people are buying it because the previous history, socialist history, is meaningless to them.
Ben, I just want to follow up on that cultural fault line there, because I know a number of people have defined this whole clash to be against woke culture, so to speak, this kind of backlash against that, if we want to term it that. I know that it feels like there's a constituency of people that perhaps feels that they don't really understand the world that they're living anymore. So are people now no longer voting on the economy? Are they now voting on cultural divides?
It seems to me very much so. I mean, as we cover everything up to and including Moscow and beyond. And the further east you go, the stronger the reaction is against the woke culture. If you listen to what Putin said, he ridicules it, and actually is a rallying point for the Russians, the young Russians as well, behind him, as he says, look at Berlin and its Christopher Street gay parade. This is ridiculous, and there's a lot of sympathy for that view in Central and Eastern Europe, and down into the Balkans, it's the same thing, if not stronger. And the woke culture versus the traditional Orthodox, but then again, when the leaders in Czech or Hungary or Poland or Serbia are selling these ideas to their people, the traditional family Orthodox values are very easy sell, whereas the sort of more woke, liberal, multicultural, multi-gender, denominational cultures, that's much harder sell, or rather it doesn't make much sense to the people there, so it's easier. This is one of the reasons I think is driving people like Orban, who came in Hungary, who came in as a sort of liberal reformer and is now gone increasingly further right in order to solidify his control, and it works very well.
Well, we saw a shift from, centre or left to the right around Brexit in the UK. That really became a flashpoint for the right. And I'm curious, Paul, we heard rhetoric then from Boris Johnson about essentially making Britain great again, if we want to use that phrase. Is this about trying to distance itself from the values of the European project, as we've been talking about?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm thinking about, sort of Boris Johnson as somebody who kind of used aspects and elements of a populist style of politics, was, sort of well noted on, and certainly there was clear borrowings there. I think that, it's just to go back to kind of the previous point as well, around wokeness as well. I think we kind of, as analysts, we need to be careful about not kind of taking on those kind of binaries between woke culture versus anti-woke culture,
Sure.
to be honest. I think that most people don't live in that kind of reality. I think don't identify with either kind of category. Most people are more moderated and don't kind of have those polarized positions. The far right, on the other hand, really likes to play on that sense that there's an us and them. There's kind of neat, simplistic binaries for understanding the world. So to relate that to Brexit, then there was a kind of a neat binary around freeing Britain from a dominating European project. But as I say, those are kind of messages that might appeal to people, especially in a kind of a stark and pithy kind of social media kind of context and language. Sure. But if we're not just to kind of talk about and describe the far right, but also analyze it, challenge it a bit, then I think we need to say that those categories themselves, those simple binaries themselves, are really actually super problematic. Moreover, when you kind of look at wider work surveying societies, cultures, most people don't operate in that kind of sphere anyway. And as media commentators, if we don't kind of problematize that, then that in itself is a problem.
Well, moving away from binaries, let me ask you, Eleonora, I'm curious how Giorgia Meloni is now viewed, not only in Italy, but also by the EU, because her party had its roots in fascism, but now it's being described as a post-fascist party. She's professed her support for the EU, her support for NATO. Is a normalization of the far right happening within European politics then?
Well, I don't know if there is a normalization, but there is the idea that, the EU needs Italy to be working, to be, on the side of the West in this specific moment. So, of course, since this government has been elected, and at the moment, this government is not perpetuating any politics which is against, the EU or, NATO or the Western Alliance. So somehow, the EU is working with Meloni. On the other hand, Meloni is playing, a sort of normal game, in the sense that she is adopting politics within, the European framework. She's not making, extremely dangerous declarations when it comes to foreign policy. I think, the main effect of her government are felt, within Italy, in the sense that she has raised, the anti-migration rhetorics and the idea, that we need to protect Italian citizens and we need to provide for Italian citizens. But it's mainly rhetoric, in the sense that when it comes to real actions, nothing has really changed much for the moment.
Sure. Well, I want to take a moment to look at what might happen in the future, because we've talked about this being driven by the economy and economic crises, and we know that income inequality is rising. There's been a pandemic, there's a war in Ukraine, there's an economic crisis, no end in sight. The migrant crisis is continuing, and that's also been a real flashpoint. Presumably then, Eleonora, these parties are going to continue making gains.
Well, yes, it depends on how traditional parties will be able to reform themselves and, provide, more concrete answers to the people. I think also one of the problems is that Europe is an old continent, and the older generation has been seeing, so many, shifts in the way of living, economic, cultural, and whatever. So this is making them, those, group of people very much in fear of any change or of losing, their welfare. And those are the ones supporting mostly, anti-establishment movement. But this doesn't mean that in the future those parties will remain in power. I believe, for the moment, since we are living in a moment of shift at national, in my case, but also European international level, I think, those parties will be put at test. But, the chance for them to survive is really limited, especially because in the case of Italy, for instance, they are perpetuating the same traditional politics than previous parties.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out, and also where the European project goes from here. Well, thank you to all of our guests, Ben Aris, Eleonora, Poli and Paul Jackson, and thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.